Welcome back to a new episode. Today, we're going back to 2008 to revisit the collapse of Lehman Brothers. It's a story that still has a lot to teach us about risk, hubris, and the interconnectedness of the global financial system.
It's a fascinating case study, really. You have this once mighty firm, a pillar of Wall Street, brought down by a confluence of factors, both internal and external.
We've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's start by setting the stage. Before the 2008 crisis, Lehman Brothers was a name synonymous with success on Wall Street, right?
Absolutely. Lehman had a long history, dating back to the mid-19th century, but the early 2000s. Under the leadership of Dick Fuld, they had become a global powerhouse in investment banking, trading, and asset management.
But their success was also tied to a particular culture, one that would ultimately contribute to their downfall.
That's right. Lehman was known for its aggressive, risk-taking culture. Driven in part by Fuld's demanding leadership style, there was also a strong element of employee ownership, with a significant portion of their wealth tied to the company's stock.
So their success was literally their own, creating a sense of shared destiny, but also perhaps a reluctance to acknowledge potential problems.
Exactly. And those problems were brewing in the form of the subprime mortgage crisis. As early as 2007, cracks were starting to appear in the U.S. housing market, with defaults on subprime mortgages rising rapidly.
These were the loans given to borrowers with poor credit scores, and often with little or no documentation. A lot of people were getting mortgages they really couldn't afford.
Right, and those mortgages were then bundled together and sold off as mortgage-backed securities. These were seen as safe investments, even though they contained a lot of risky loans.
So when the housing bubble burst, the value of these securities plummeted, and the whole financial system started to unravel.
Precisely. Bear Stearns, another investment bank heavily involved in the subprime market, nearly collapsed in March of 2008 and had to be bailed out by J.P. Morgan Chase with government assistance. It was a huge warning sign that something was seriously wrong.
So how did Lehman respond to this growing crisis? Did they see the writing on the wall?
There were some internal voices raising concerns, particularly in the fixed income division, which was more exposed to the risks in the mortgage market. But it seems those warnings were largely ignored.
Why? Were they just blinded by their past success?
There were several factors at play. Fuld himself was known for his stubbornness and his belief that Lehman could weather the storm. There were also internal power struggles and a culture that discouraged dissent.
We've heard that Joe Gregory, Lehman's COO and Fuld's right-hand man, played a role in stifling dissenting voices.
Gregory was a controversial figure. Some saw him as ruthless and more interested in consolidating his own power than in addressing the firm's problems. He was accused of sidelining anyone he perceived as a threat, even those with expertise in risk management.
So while the financial crisis was unfolding outside Lehman's doors, there was a separate drama playing out inside the firm, with potentially disastrous consequences.
Exactly. As the crisis deepened, analysts and investors began to question the value of Lehman's assets, particularly their massive holdings of real estate.
There were even accusations that they were using accounting tricks to hide the true extent of their problems. This mark-to-make-believe practice allowed them to inflate the value of their assets on paper, giving a misleading picture of their financial health.
That's right. And it wasn't just outside observers who were skeptical. One prominent hedge fund manager, David Einhorn, publicly questioned Lehman's accounting practices and began betting against the firm.
Einhorn's reputation carried a lot of weight, so his skepticism further eroded confidence in Lehman. It was becoming clear that they needed a lifeline, and fast. What steps did they take to try and right the ship?
They explored a number of options, including raising capital from outside investors and seeking a merger with another firm. Their first major attempt was to secure a significant investment from Korea Development Bank.
So they were looking for a savior on the global stage. Did that pan out?
Initially, it seemed promising, but ultimately the deal fell apart. The Koreans grew concerned about a lack of transparency from Lehman and what they perceived as constantly shifting demands. This failure sent a clear signal to the market that Lehman was in serious trouble.
It must have been incredibly stressful for everyone involved, knowing that the clock was ticking and the stakes were getting higher by the day.
Absolutely. They're running out the time and options. One of their next moves was a rather surprising one. They tried to bring in Warren Buffett as an investor.
Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha. It's almost like they were hoping his reputation alone could save them.
Perhaps. But Buffett, known for his shrewdness, drove a hard bargain, proposing terms that Lehman ultimately found unacceptable.
So that was another dead end. Who else did they turn to?
In a last-ditch effort, Fold reached out to potential buyers, including Bank of America and Barclays.
These were major players in the financial world. Was there any interest?
Bank of America initially showed some interest, but ultimately decided to acquire Merrill Lynch instead, another firm struggling amidst the crisis. That left Barclays, the British bank, as the most likely savior. However, their bid for Lehman was contingent on receiving guarantees from the U.S. government, which would prove to be a major sticking point.
So this is where the government's role in the crisis becomes crucial. Let's talk about the key players on that side. We have Hank Paulson, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and Tim Geithner, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Yes, those two figures were at the center of the storm. Paulson, a former Goldman Sachs CEO, brought a Wall Street mentality to the Treasury. He was known for his tough, no-nonsense style.
And Geithner.
Geithner had a deep understanding of the financial system. Having spent years at the Treasury and the New York Fed, he was well equipped to navigate the complexities of the crisis.
So both men were seasoned veterans of the financial world, but they were facing an unprecedented challenge.
Absolutely. The world was watching as they tried to figure out how to contain the crisis, and as the situation with Lehman deteriorated, the pressure on them intensified dramatically.
It sounds like the stage was set for a high-stakes showdown.
It was the fate of Lehman, and arguably the stability of the entire global financial system, hung in the balance as that fateful weekend approached.
So let's talk about that weekend. It's September 2008, and Lehman is on the brink. What was the atmosphere like?
It was tense. Very tense. You could feel the pressure in the room. Everyone knew the stakes.
They were running out of time, right? The markets were going to open on Monday.
Exactly. It was a race against the clock.
So what were the options at that point? I mean, was there any way to salvage the situation?
Realistically, there were only two. Find a buyer or a government bailout.
We talk about how Bank of America chose Merrill Lynch, and Barclays wanted guarantees from the government. It sounds like Paulson and Geithner were in a tough spot.
Yeah, they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
So why couldn't they reach a deal? I mean, what were the main sticking points?
Well, on one hand, you had Fold. He seemed to believe that Paulson would eventually cave and provide a bailout.
So he was reluctant to make concessions.
Right. He was holding out hope.
And on the other side, you had Paulson.
Yeah, Paulson was absolutely against giving guarantees.
He was worried about setting a precedent, right?
Exactly. He called it moral hazard. He didn't want to encourage reckless behavior by signaling that the government would always be there to bail out Wall Street.
But letting Lehman fail, that was a huge risk too, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a gamble. But Paulson seemed convinced that the markets could handle it, that it would be a painful but necessary correction, a lesson for Wall Street.
But it didn't quite turn out that way, did it?
No, it didn't. The consequences of Lehman's collapse were far more severe than anyone anticipated.
So on September 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy filing in U.S. history at the time.
It was a seismic event. It sent shockwaves through the entire global financial system and marked the beginning of the most severe financial crisis since the Great Depression.
I remember it was just chaos.
Yeah.
The markets went into a free fall.
It was panic, pure panic. Stock markets plummeted, credit markets froze up,
People were losing their jobs.
their homes.
It was a global crisis, sparked by the collapse of a single firm.
It's hard to believe that one company could have such a massive impact.
That's the thing about the financial system. It's interconnected. What happens in one part of the world can quickly spread to others.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And in this case, the dominoes were falling fast.
So Lehman's collapse was a watershed moment, wasn't it? It exposed the fragility of the financial system and raised serious questions about the role of government intervention.
It certainly did. It was a wake-up call. For regulators, for investors, for everyone.
It's kind of wild to think about how this all started, right? Like we were talking about risky mortgages, and now we're talking about like the whole global economy like tanking. Yeah, it's a real testament to how interconnected everything is. Like one part of the system starts to wobble and it can bring the whole thing down.
So after all this went down, there was a lot of talk about fixing the system, making sure this kind of thing never happens again.
Why there had to be some accountability.
So what actually happened? What changed?
Well, one of the biggest things was Dodd-Frank.
Dodd-Frank.
The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act.
Okay, yeah, I remember hearing about that. It was a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, yeah, massive. I mean, it was a huge piece of legislation aimed at basically overhauling the financial regulatory system.
So like a total system reboot.
Pretty much. They wanted to address like all the root causes of the crisis
Hmm.
and try to prevent another meltdown.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what did it actually do?
Well, a lot of things, but some of the key provisions were they established the Financial Stability Oversight Council.
That's that.
It's basically like an early warning system for potential crises. They're tasked with identifying and responding to like systemic risks in the financial system.
Oh, okay. So they're like the watchdogs now, making sure nothing sneaky is going on.
Exactly. And then they also created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
What do they do?
They're focused on protecting consumers from predatory lending practices. So, making sure people aren't getting tricked into bad mortgages and stuff.
Oh, so like those subprime loans that started this whole mess.
Exactly. They were trying to prevent that kind of thing from happening again.
That's good. Anything else?
Yeah. Dodd-Frank also included provisions aimed at like increasing transparency in the derivatives market, those weapons of mass destruction Buffett talked about.
Oh, yeah.
So they wanted to bring those under control, make sure nobody was hiding anything too risky.
Smart.
And then they also wanted to reduce excessive leverage in the financial system, making sure banks weren't taking on more risk than they could handle.
So basically making sure everyone was playing by the rules and not getting too greedy.
Pretty much. I mean, it was a major overhaul of financial regulations. It was a huge effort to try and make the system safer and more stable.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing not everyone was happy about it.
Oh, no, definitely not. Dodd-Frank has been pretty controversial over the years. Some people think it went too far, that it stifled economic growth.
Ah, so like too much government intervention.
Right. And then others think it didn't go far enough, that it didn't really solve the underlying problems.
So the debate's still going on.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a really complex issue. Figuring out that balance between, regulation and free markets.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot. Well, it's definitely a conversation worth having. I mean, look at what happened when things went unchecked.
Exactly. The 2008 crisis was a wake-up call for everyone. It showed us just how fragile the system can be and how quickly things can spiral out of control.
It also showed us how much our everyday lives are connected to what happens on Wall Street.
That's right. It's not just numbers and spreadsheets. Real people are affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. Well, I think this has been a really insightful look at the Lehman Brothers collapse and the whole 2008 financial crisis.
It's a story that's still relevant today. I mean, we're still dealing with the fallout in many ways.
Definitely. And I think it's important to remember these lessons to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Couldn't agree more. We need to be vigilant, informed, and always pushing for a more stable and equitable financial system for everyone.
Well said. Thanks for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.